Hello once again and welcome as ever. I wanted to visit again Gurdjieff's ideas about modern education. And I'll say something about criticizing others and something about subtle emotional work. So let's listen to Mr. G, see what he has to say. Although I could freely observe the existence proceeding on the surface of the other planets of that solar system through my Tescoano on the planet Mars, without any difficulty whatsoever, my observations of the process of the existence of your favourites was at times a real misery, owing to the special coloration of the atmosphere of the planet Earth. And this special coloration occurred, as I later ascertained, because from time to time there appear in the presence of this atmosphere large quantities of those crystallisations which are frequently radiated from the presence of these favourites of yours when they are moved by the particular inner impulse which they call remorse of conscience. And this is because when they happen to receive and experience some kind of moral shock, the associations proceeding in them from impressions previously perceived, associations that consist mainly, as I've already told you, of various kinds of rubbish, almost always become changed, calmed, and even for a time entirely cease. In consequence, there automatically takes place in the common presence of these three-brained beings there a combination of functioning that frees the data present in their subconscious for the manifestation of the divine impulse of objective conscience, and temporarily allows it to participate in the functioning of their ordinary consciousness, with the result that this remorse of conscience begins to proceed in them, and the remorse of conscience thus produced in your favourites gives rise to those particular crystallisations I have mentioned which issue from them, mixed with other radiations, and it is the totality of these radiations that gives the atmosphere of your planet that special coloration which hinders the being function of sight from penetrating freely through it. These favourites of yours, particularly the contemporary ones, have become experts in preventing this inner impulse of theirs called remorse of conscience from lingering long in their common presence. No sooner do they begin to sense a twinge, or even the slightest prick of the arising of the functioning in them of this being impulse, than they immediately squash it, whereupon this impulse, not yet quite formed in them, promptly subsides. Modern people are pretty strange, and they certainly are experts at destroying themselves, and I wanted to ask the question why, and get on to modern education. This passage, like others, has got many subjects in it. I just want to quickly mention that he talks about what is visible and what is not visible. I was thinking this week that if every time you had a thought or a feeling it created something concrete, it would not be possible to live. Those products have to be invisible. They have to be physically penetrable. Part of the world we live in is physical, and part of it is of subtle matters, and they coexist. But if every time you had a feeling it created solid matter, it would obviously block up the world and we wouldn't be able to live here. So this three-part structure is required for life. In terms of our own inner structure, my sense is that the first story is given. The second story is the domain in which we work. That means our family life and our economic work takes place with those three middle story centres. If we are fortunate enough to master that kind of work and become a fully rounded person, then we enter into the third story, which is called the religious domain. And it is called that because if the current flows through three stories, it is able to triangulate objective consciousness. It is the same as triangulating the summit of a mountain, except that the beams are made from different materials. Gurdjieff heavily criticised modern education, saying that the university was just that stove upon which centuries of culture was destroyed, and a 1.5 day tasty lentil soup was cooked to take its place. And Gurdjieff said that real languages and real knowledge is always formed around a particular idea or around a particular type of work. For instance, somebody who is a leather worker has certain language that he uses that relates to working leather, and has a certain smock or apron and tools to do that work. It has an end goal and an end result, the worked leather. And all those guilds, from the middle period of Europe, were like that. Here are some photos of the bakers who lived, for instance, on Baker Street with Sherlock Holmes in London. The masons. And the woolsmiths. Each of these trades had their own craft and their own language, and even their own weights and measures, and Britain was particularly rich in having many different trades together. Some more physical, some more artistic, William Morris and so on, and it carried on century after century, and the country became very, very wealthy in terms of its culture. Some of these had feudal origins, some came from pagan traditions like the apothecaries and the astrologers and so on. Some came straight out of the Catholic Church. Some were given royal warrants, and it created incredible amounts of knowledge, of an interleaved knowledge within the country. Each guild had hundreds or thousands of specialists, which brought incredible light into society. And each of these, at a higher level, almost becomes a religious practice, because they did reach higher levels, and there was a chain of knowledge from the orders of that particular guild. That is real knowledge. They have intellectual knowledge, and they even had their own songs and their own prayers, but it was all tied into the work that they were actually doing. Modern education has no relation to this at all. It is completely divorced from any real physical work, and it just ends up being a lot of words. And once those words crystallize in people's heads, then when you speak to such people who come out of modern education, you're just speaking to this kind of chain of words that goes around in their head, and their heart and their body and their hands are not involved. These people, Gurdjieff said, would basically live in this mechanical way, almost like a machine, with a tiki-taka of these words going around their head, whilst the soul inside their heart is completely untouched, and these people would live 70-80 years and then get buried, and their soul would still be in a completely untouched state in their heart, having never lived because of that kind of education. Here's something from Mr. Jesus. He says, "I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and reveal them to little children." Here Jesus is being almost sarcastic, because he recognizes, as many people did, that those people who think too much seem to not produce anything with all their big words. And there's a natural law here, because when you get to a high level, there are very severe barriers, which are the breaks in the octave. And often things fail just before they get to the top. And when they fail, a lot of energy is released, and it creates all sorts of pseudo groups and broken knowledge. On the subject of criticising others, Gurdjieff said once again that modern people were robbed because they did not get the feedback from their peers that was normal in a society. Though when I was young, in the 70s and 80s, it did happen that any adult would just walk up to you and discipline you in the street, even if you had never seen them before in your life. And there was a kind of pride and a sense of national unity when that happened. I've seen it many times happen to me. And adults were treated with a kind of awe and respect, even then. That's a society, but of course everybody was white British at that time. And so these things have faded away. And so a world where you don't criticize each other and you don't receive criticism is a dead world. It's not a sign of health. In spiritual circles, sometimes they talk like that, that you shouldn't be negative and so on. This refers, I think, to a very holy era, maybe in a different yuga when there were saints everywhere and the world was full of light. Then the angel would appear in your bedroom at night and tell you that you had been chosen by God. And a different kind of path of extreme peace may have been possible. And so those ideas are vestigial from that kind of holy era, which we no longer live in. Now one has to fight. Intelligence can only be produced by friction, by criticism, by physical work. The way to criticize people, the meaning of it, is normally set by the teacher. If the teacher knows what to do, then the students will know what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. One rule I think is very good is that you do not criticize somebody else unless you can offer an actual solution, a better way of doing it. Although it's not always like that. Sometimes you just need to calm people down and stop them doing what they're doing. I was just thinking that it's very difficult to find good material on the internet. I like to look at the internet, but actually most of it's completely disturbing. I was listening to an American guy earlier on, somebody who I like a lot, and he was saying that he's decided politically that he's not going to be a nationalist because he lives in Chicago and there's just a lot of foreign people there. Well, the problem with that is that reality doesn't care what you think. Nature is very used to seeing human beings destroy themselves and refusing to face reality. Nature sees it all the time. The reality is that culture is only produced one way. One race plus one religion. You have to stand back and realize what kind of a place you live in, for God's sake. Anyway, I listened to Julius Evola, Prabhupada, and everything from Gurdjieff and the early students. And then I suppose literature before from about 1700. This week I started doing a little bit of Stations of the Cross in a very simple pared down way. The first station, Jesus is condemned to death by Pilate, one Our Father, one Hail Mary. Something simple. I was doing it for a while and I realized something. There is a kind of emotional work there, set amongst this ancient story. And by performing this work, I'm actually entering into this emotional work. Just like the goldsmiths who shear the sheep. They have a certain kind of work. Well, there is other kind of work on this planet, emotional work, and this is one way of doing it. You carry the cross, so-called, with Jesus. It's like you carry these emotional feelings and you do that work, and it penetrates the atmosphere somehow. I think if you look carefully at society, you will be able to see it in many places, that the activities of people don't really make sense until you recognize that they're singing their song, or they're carrying on some kind of emotional tradition, as they do in the open parliament, for instance, and Black Rod bangs on the door. that means that an official in the British Parliament arrives with a long black rod and he literally bangs it on the door. There's lots of traditions like that. Another passage from Mr. G. Observation of the activity of imagination and daydreaming forms a very important part of self-study. The next object of self-observation must be habits in general. Every grown-up man consists wholly of habits, although he is often unaware of it and even denies having any habits at all. This can never be the case. All three centers are filled with habits, and a man can never know himself until he has studied all his habits. The observation and the study of habits is particularly difficult because in order to see and record them, one must escape from them, from oneself from them, if only for a moment. So long as a man is governed by a particular habit, he does not observe it, but at the very first attempt, however feeble, to struggle against it, he feels it and notices it. Therefore, in order to observe and study habits, one must try to struggle against them. This opens up a practical method of self-observation. It has been said before that a man cannot change anything in himself, that he can only observe and record. This is true, but it is also true that a man cannot observe and record anything if he does not try to struggle with himself, that is, with his habits. This struggle cannot yield direct results, that is to say, it cannot lead to any change, especially to any permanent and lasting change, but it shows what is there. Without a struggle, a man cannot see what he consists of. The struggle with small habits is very difficult and boring, but without it, self-observation is impossible. This is a very important passage for those many people who are dreaming that they can self-observe, just in general. And Gurdjieff says that even at the beginning you can change things, but it will not lead to permanent change, but you begin. Inside, we are a tritocosmos. Therefore, we are quite large beings. We're not microcosmos, we are tritocosmos. Inside, there is a whole world of things. Most people will never know what those things are, since they live in the tiki-taka of the crystallizations formed in their head during their education, and that mean almost nothing. But there is an entire universe of possibilities, of energy, of power inside. How to get at it? That's the question. To learn about yourself, to learn what is true, is certainly not about what personally benefits you. What is true is just true, and it is only that that can save you. I let go of everything not divinely designed for me, and the plan of my life comes to pass. I let go of worn-out conditions and worn-out things, and order is established in my mind, in my body, and in my affairs. Behold, I make all things new. Behold, I make all things new. Behold, I make all things new. Amen.